If you had the dream to be a famous writer against all odds, what would you do? Hey poets, wanna watch a movie? So now that we have entered the new year and we are in that nebulous time where the winter joy has left and now we're just kind of waiting for spring and the sun to come back out, I thought to revisit one of my favorite movies of all time that takes place during this wintry season. And of course, this was encouraged when I went on TikTok and I kept seeing edits of this movie all over my For You page. So today, we are going to be diving into a cultural reset of a movie, the 2019 version of Little Women. So before we fully dive into this, I want to put it out there that this movie is not told in chronological order, but I will be telling them in chronological order in order to help the flow of this story. So we're not jumping back and forth. So I know that the movie is told out of order. Trust me. This is just to help with the structure of this video. So we open this movie by seeing Jo, the most outspoken, bold sister of the four, running off to go and try and get her book published. And not long after, we kind of establish Jo's stakes in her trying to become a writer. We then travel back in time where we meet all four of the March sisters. There's Meg, who's the eldest, then followed by Jo, who's the spunky, outspoken sister. Then there is Beth, who is the softer-spoken middle sister. And then there is Amy, And these sisters live in Massachusetts during the Civil War with their mom, who is struggling to make ends meet while their father is off fighting in the Civil War. So it's Christmas morning in the March household, and the girls are so excited to dive into their Christmas Day feast until their mother stops them and says that they should give part of their feast to this family that lives nearby who is struggling more than they are. And the girls, of course, agree to do so, and this is where we meet Lori, who is one of their nearby neighbors who's very, very wealthy and also very, very moved by the fact that these women are giving up their Christmas Day feast in order for another family to eat. Lori also lives with his grandfather, Mr. Lawrence, he's the one with the money, and he's also the one who, while the Marches are away, giving their feast up for this family. The Lawrences sneakily get them a feast for them to enjoy at their cabin. Still in the past, Meg and Jo get invited to this very, very fancy party for the holidays where Jo meets Lori properly. And neither Jo nor Lori is particularly interested in this super fancy party, and then Meg tells Jo that the bottom of her dress is ruined, and so Lori and Jo both go outside and they kind of jokingly dance with each other on the porch. That is until Meg sprains her ankle, and then they all have to leave and go back to the March residence. During this time, we also meet Aunt March, who is just an icon, and we meet her when Jo spends her time reading to her, and Aunt March goes on and talks about how she wants Jo to be a proper lady and to marry a rich man. Aunt March is very, very bold in wanting Jo to become a proper lady, so much so that Aunt March will take Jo to Europe with her so that she can learn how to be a lady. And then during this time, we also see Beth start to form a really close relationship with Mr. Lawrence, because the families are starting to get closer, and Mr. Lawrence tells her that she reminds him of his deceased daughter. And he says to her that she is more than welcome to come over and play the piano because she is an incredible pianist. Still in the past, there is one evening where Meg and Jo are asked to go to a play by Lori and John, who is Lori's tutor. Amy begs them to let her go too, in typical younger sibling fashion, and Jo very rudely says that she cannot go. So, in a way to get back at Jo for being rude and not letting her go hang out with Lori and everyone, she decides that she is going to burn Jo's book, which is highly critiqued in this movie, and that a lot of people talk about how Amy was immature, but I'll tell all of you that she is 12 And who hasn't done something dumb when they were 12? Anyway, when Jo comes back, she's obviously devastated that her book has been completely destroyed, burned to a crisp, and Amy apologizes, but Jo just completely shuts her out. Which, fair enough. During the 1800s, there wasn't really anything to undo such a tragedy. You just had to start again, and I can only imagine Jo's frustrations when she realized that. The next day, Laurie and Jo go ice skating, and again, Amy is trying to apologize to Jo and chases after her. Jo ignores Amy again and doesn't warn her that the lake that they are skating on is not the strongest. And so Amy kind of falls through the lake into the ice water. Laurie and Jo rescue her then, and Jo's like, okay, this has gone too far. We're fine. Everything's fine now. And then in Meg's quest line, Meg gets invited to a really fancy party, and she dresses up and meets all these suitors, and one of the suitors happens to be Laurie. And instead of having that moment of like, oh, my friend, welcome to this event where we can meet our suitors and potential matches, Laurie decides to shame her for trying to fit in with a rich culture and just offends her, which is just insane for him to do that. Unprompted. There was no reason, but he apologizes, all is forgiven, and the sisters decide to make a secret club of their own in order to help Meg feel better about being rejected by rich society, and Jo decides that they're going to invite Laurie into this club. Something else to note during this time period is that Laurie puts up a mailbox in the woods so that they can pass secret messages to each other. Meg falls in love with Laurie's tutor, Mr. John, and despite him being poor, they still get married because true love or something like that. Beth decides, as a thank you for letting her play on the piano, she gifts Mr. Lawrence a pair of shoes that she made, and he in turn gifts her the piano. And then the March's mother receives word that Mr. March has been wounded on the battlefield of the Civil War, and so she decides that she needs to go and be with him and help take care of him. And since they are struggling to make ends meet, Jo decides to cut off all of her hair so that her mother can go on this trip. And she does, accompanied by John. And before leaving, the mother tells all of the girls to make sure that they check in on their poorer neighbors so that they can get help if they need it. And most of the girls neglect to do so, with the exception of Beth. So Beth goes on her own, and because of this, she catches scarlet fever. And being unaware that she has scarlet fever, she goes to thank Mr. Lawrence for the piano, but he's the one who catches the fact that she is burning up from her fever. Since Jo and Meg have had it before, they're immune to it, and so they stay in the house to help Beth. But since Amy has never had it, they send her to go live with Aunt March. And while with Aunt March, mind you, Amy is 12, Aunt March tells Amy that since Meg has married a poor boy and Jo is not inclined to marry, it is all up to Amy to save her family and marry rich. Again, Amy is 12, maybe 13 at this point. Still very young. Just putting it out there. When Beth won't get better, Jo and Meg send word to their mother, who is off taking care of their father, saying that Beth is sick and they can't help her. So their mom comes back, nurses Beth back to health. Everything is good. Everything is great, just in time for Christmas. And on Christmas Day, John returns with a surprise. Mr. March, who is eager to see all of his little women. And there's so much Christmas joy in this scene. They put on a little play. It's very warm, cozy. Everything seems perfect in their lives. Meg and John get married, which is great. Aunt March hates it, but it's fine. And at this wedding, Aunt March also invites Amy to Europe because Amy shows the most promise of becoming a lady, but Jo is upset that Amy got that invite. Laurie tells Jo that he wants to marry her and that he is madly in love with her, to which Jo shuts him down. She thinks that it's a horrible idea to be married to him because it could negatively impact their relationship if things don't work out. And besides, she doesn't want to be married. And something that I love about the way that this scene is played is how Laurie talks about the inevitability that Jo will find someone who she unapologetically loves and will die for. And he's sort of frustrated by that fact and knowing that that will never be him. So Laurie is devastated by this, and then Jo goes to move to New York to work in a boarding house, and she continues to write stories where she then meets Mr. Dashwood. And at this boarding house, she meets Friedrich, who is a fellow boarder there, and he reads her work and he actually critiques her. And upon receiving criticism, Jo is furious about this. Meanwhile, in France, Amy is working on a painting and learning how to be a professional artist and all around being a lady. And she ends up running into Laurie. She invites him to come to this huge party to meet the man that is courting her named Fred. And then he eventually stands her up, and then at the party he shows up drunk and just humiliates her and makes this huge scene, and it's a low point for Laurie. Later, he then shows up at her painting studio to apologize, kind of. And this scene really shows how much Amy has matured since being in Europe and the events that take place in the past when she's 12 versus the events that take place in the present, where she's closer to 20 to 22. Laurie tells Amy that she should not marry Fred, that she should marry for love and not for money, and Amy responds with one of the most banger monologues I have ever heard. She talks about how marriage is an economic proposition, and she cannot marry for love when she has her entire family to take care of, and she can have no possessions in this life. It is beautifully written, beautifully acted, no notes, perfect monologue. And to close this scene, when Fred arrives in a carriage, Amy asks Laurie to help her out of her artist smock, and she asks Laurie how she looks, and he, for the first time, seemingly realizes just how beautiful Amy is. But enough of that French love story. Back in America, Jo receives word that Beth is gravely ill, and so she leaves New York. She ends up taking Beth to the beach and is kind of writing a story for her when Beth says that she knows that she is going to die. Jo's like, no, you're not. You're not going to die. Don't be stupid, Beth. And Beth then tells Jo to just keep writing stories and to write one for her, which of course Jo does. But Beth succumbs to her illness and dies, which devastates the entire family, with the exception of Amy, who has not heard that her sister was even deathly ill in the first place. Regardless, in America, Jo tells her mother that she regrets shutting down Laurie and that maybe she does actually love him. Her mother asks if she's in love with Laurie, and Jo, kind of mixing up loneliness with love and that sort of gray area, she decides to write a letter and to put it in their secret mailbox telling Laurie just how much she adores him. Back in France, Amy has now found out that Beth has died, and so she is going to go back home to America, and she is being accompanied by Laurie. And she tells Laurie that she had turned down the proposal of Fred, who is the man who was charming her the entire time she was in France. And at this word, Laurie then kisses her. And there's this scene in between Beth dying and Jo realizing that she might be in love with Laurie, where Amy, again, delivers this banger line delivery. Laurie and Amy are in the park together, and Laurie is being a little cocky and again being like, you shouldn't marry Fred. And Amy's asking him why, and he says that he's in love with her, which sets Amy off, and she says that she will not marry him because she's been second to Jo her entire life, and she will not be with him because Laurie cannot have her. She is truly so upset by him because she thinks that he's just toying with her emotions, but I guess after reflecting on her thoughts and feelings, Amy decided that she would take a risk with Laurie, and so he's the one that accompanies her back to America so that she can be with her family. When these two arrive back, Laurie tells Joe that he's married Amy, which I'm not entirely sure when that took place because we don't see their wedding, but they're married now. And she's shocked by this because she just put in a letter in their secret mailbox saying that she's in love with him, but she puts on a happy front and it expresses her happiness for both Laurie and Amy. She manages to slip away from this happy reunion and runs to the mailbox to get the letter and just tears it to shreds so that Laurie never finds out. As the family is sort of having this memorial for Beth, Mr. Lawrence comes up to the house, but he cannot bring himself to go in knowing that Beth won't be there. So Joe walks up and she offers her support, knowing that she is not Beth, but she will be a friend to him. And Joe, who is now having this identity crisis where she doesn't know if her writing is even good enough after receiving a critique from Friedrich, she burns most of her writings until she finds the one that she wrote for Beth. And upon discovering this writing again, she starts to write feverishly through the night. She ends up writing several chapters of a book and she sends it to Mr. Dashwood in the hopes that it gets printed. And originally Mr. Dashwood says that it's too small and domestic to be worthwhile, but when his daughters discover the story, they end up falling in love with it. During this time, Friedrich also shows up in Massachusetts to check in on Joe, claiming that he was in the area, and the entire family ends up loving him. And at this sort of dinner that he's having with the family, he says he has a job offer in California, and since he has nothing on the East Coast, he might as well take it. And he rides off he goes to ride off into the night. When he leaves, everyone tells Joe that she should go after him, so Meg and Amy both take Joe in carriage to catch him in the rain. The scene gets interrupted by a meeting that Joe is having with Mr. Dashwood, where he is critiquing the ending of the book, where the heroine does not end up with a man. She says that the character never wanted to be married in the beginning, so that's how it's going to end, but when he says that the book won't sell as well because there's no happy love ending, she decides to change the ending. And then they kind of go back and forth over who gets what percentage of book sales, and Joe is very firm on keeping the rights herself. And then we go back to this scene with Amy, Joe, and Meg, where they catch up to Friedrich, and Joe gets out of the carriage and chases after him before he can leave forever. She stops him, and these two share a kiss with the sisters in the background. Aunt March then dies and gives the home to Joe, who then turns it into a school, which is really cool. The whole extended March family, including Friedrich and Amy and Laurie's child, all celebrate their mother's birthday. And there's this moment of happiness where it seems like everyone has found their happy ending in this story. Meanwhile, at the printing press, Joe has finally received her first copy of her book, Little Women. And thus ends Little Women. Now, like I said in the beginning, this movie is genuinely one of my favorites. I was not expecting to love it as much as I did, but wow, oh wow, it was so good. And I'm not the only one who thought that, because let's check out those numbers really quick. The budget for this movie was $40 million, and it made $218.9 million in box offices, which, wow, oh my gosh, that is insane. And with a profit like that, the movie just had to have been well received, and it was. On IMDb, it's got a 7.8 out of 10 with 235,000 reviews and a Metascore of 91. Then on Rotten Tomatoes, it's got a 95% on the tomato meter and an audience score of 92% with over 10,000 reviews. People seemingly had fallen in love with the star-studded cast, the absolute gorgeous aesthetics of this film, and the contemporary adaptation of a classic tale. And one of the greatest things that I adore about this film is how easy it is to distinguish what's in the past versus what's in the present based off of the lighting of the scene. With the past having these warmer colors that invoke a feeling of nostalgia and longing to be within that time and moment again, versus the present having these much cooler tones that signify the unrest that the March sisters are going through now that they're adults. It is so beautifully done. I've talked about it a couple of times, but I love when directors and designers have that intentionality in the scenes that they create, in the moments that they create, where the lighting and the furniture and everything about the visual of the scene tells you what time period you're in rather than a card popping up saying that you're in this year. Having something as simple as the lighting temperature help you interpret the scene is just, I love it. I love it so much. The writing of this script is also absolutely incredible. I'll leave a link down below so that you can check it out. But the way Greta Gerwig wrote this script is fascinating. It's very much written in a way where when they have those big group scenes, that it feels as though it's a large family discussion, and it's done very successfully. Before filming even started, Greta sat down with most of the cast and they worked on how to deliver this dialogue so it sounded like they were actually like genuinely rushing to cut off each other in this big group scene. It's so well paced and it's such an interesting way of being written where the cast had to memorize the exact words someone else would say so that they could then jump in with their line and create this chaotic everyone's talking over each other feeling. It's a very neat thing to look at, so I'll leave a link down below so all of you can check it out if you're interested. But I think this style of writing really helped to make the movie feel real and grounded and as though this family was genuinely just like talking with each other and they were so excited to talk that they were cutting each other off. It flows in a very sensible way despite the chaos, which makes me feel like I'm back in a large family reunion where everyone's talking all at once. When we are talking about the script, something that I love is the ending and how when Joe is going to stop Friedrich, how they are interrupted by that meeting with Joe and Mr. Dashwood where he's like, you need to change the ending. To have that scene placed exactly at that moment is so well done because in a way it is showing how Joe's story is actively being changed and influenced by the world around her. And in the end of the movie, you're not entirely sure whether or not she ended up with Friedrich. All you know is that she's close to him. It's just such an amazing way that Greta Gerwig wrote that script and wrote that timing that is just, it's incredible. And speaking of Greta Gerwig, her directing this could not have been a better choice. Seemingly everything she touches turns to gold, from Lady Bird to Little Women to Barbie and then the Chronicles of Narnia, and she's doing Snow White. It just seems like she is unstoppable. She's talked about her own philosophy before when it comes to writing movie scripts, where they start from her life experiences and then they kind of spiral into their own worlds. And I think that that is such an incredible thing to do because it makes her stories feel so much more grounded. She really focuses on building these characters in a set and solid reality where they're very complex and their dialogue feels as though it is a genuine conversation that is happening. And the women that she writes are both vulnerable and strong, and they crave independence, but they also have that need to be loved and to love. Her stories are just very, very raw and real and all focused around love, whether it be familial love, self-love, or romantic love. Now, for some of the critiques that I read online, because of course there are always going to be critiques. Since the actresses play the older and younger versions of themselves, a lot of audience members critiqued that decision. To each their own, you're allowed to have an opinion, but I, in my opinion, really liked this decision. I think each actor was a strong enough actor to show the differences between the past version of their character and the present version of their character. Even if physically they weren't the younger version of their character, they were still able to show it with changes to their voice, changes to their facial expressions, this sort of physicality that they can control. And their motivations are clear when you are looking at the past versions of themselves versus the changes to their present version of themselves. And I also believe in this movie, it is so much less focused on the physical changes that these women go through versus the personal changes that these women go through. You are more tracking the changes of their actions and their motivations rather than how they develop as they get older physically. Some other things that I think about this movie is I love this iteration of Amy so much. This iteration made Amy seem so much more like her actions as a child were semi-justified, because as a kid you make stupid decisions and then you try to do stupid things in order to overcome that, but at the end of the day, she's just a kid. And then you see as an adult, she becomes this much more sophisticated and wise version of herself. And seeing that change and transition is fascinating. And while we're still on the topic of Amy, I think that it's interesting seeing the parallels between her and Jo in this movie. Amy is just as ambitious as Jo is, but she doesn't have as much talent as Jo does. And she's aware that she needs to put aside her dreams and her ambitions so that she can take care of the rest of her family, so they can chase their ambitions, whether it be true love or writing a book and becoming a successful author. And looking at Amy in previous iterations of this film, it seems as though a lot of people critique that she's a brat or that she continuously ruined Jo's life. However, I think Florence Pugh does a really good job at capturing the complexities of Amy March and showing that she was just a kid that then grew up into someone who is more mature and aware that she is the one that is in charge of making sure that her family is well off. And there are so many beautiful moments in this film that capture the loss of childhood, interweaving the nostalgic, warm childhood scenes in with the colder feeling modern day scenes. It is such a beautiful story that is crafted where you see these sisters start to lose the spark that they had when they were younger. You see the sacrifices that they start to make in order to fulfill their dreams and passions, some of them sacrificing a lot more than others, but that realization that you can't have everything that they had when they were children. And in this movie, Beth is truly like a pillar of their childhood, where once she dies, it's sort of that realization of, oh, it's all over now. The loss of Beth marks that they are no longer children, but women now. All in all, this is a beautiful film. I love it so much, and if you haven't watched it, I highly encourage you to do so. This retelling of Little Women gave so much depth to every single one of the sisters and made them feel so much real and so much more complex than previous versions. And it's got the vibes of a holiday movie without actually fully being a holiday movie, if that makes sense. Like in the same way that Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone is a holiday movie, this is also a holiday movie. It's not so much the story it's telling, it's the vibes. And the vibes of this movie are sensational, so you should watch it. And if you made it to the end of the video, dude, thank you so much for watching. I saw that a lot of people appreciated my previous video on the Hunger Games. Thank you. More reviews on large franchises will come soonish. It's, you know, I can only do so much with a real person job, but I'll work on it. I'll get there. Don't worry, they will come. And thank you so much for the love on that video. I wasn't expecting for there to be so many people that watched it, but there was. Hi to all the new faces here. Welcome to the media club. You are contractually obligated to stay here so that we can get an island together. And while we wait for our island, I think that this movie is a great one to watch this time of year. If you haven't seen it, watch it. If you have watched it, let me know down below what you thought of this movie. I'll send a little smooch your way, and I'll see you next time.